Chapter 25, From Umpire to Guardian. Everything seemed to be growing. While at the outbreak of the Civil War, the country had numbered 30 million people. By 1900, there were over 75 million. From 34 states, the number had grown to 45. Before the war, the nation's population was mostly between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean, plus a few sparsely settled states on the Pacific coast. By 1900, 4 transcontinental railroads poured people into the great heart of the continent and filled lands between the Mississippi River and the Sierra Nevada mountains. There were more cities, more big cities, and the big cities were bigger than ever. In 1860, only 9 cities had 100,000 people or more. By 1900, there were nearly 40 such cities, and there were 3 giant metropolises with over 1 million people each. Preamble to the Constitution of the United Mine Workers of America. Our Preamble. There is no fact more generally known or more widely believed than that without coal there would not have been any such grand achievements, privileges, and blessings as those which characterize the 19th century civilization, and believing as we do that those whose lot it is to daily toil in the recesses of the earth, mining and putting out this coal which makes these blessings possible, are entitled to a fair and equitable share of the same. Therefore, we have formed the United Mine Workers of America for the purpose of the more readily securing the object sought by educating all mine workers in America to realize the necessity of unity of action and purpose in demanding and securing by lawful means the just fruits of our toil. And we hereby declare to the world that our objects are, first, to secure an earning fully compatible with the dangers of our calling and the labor performed. Second, to establish as speedily as possible and forever our right to receive pay for labor performed in lawful money, and to rid ourselves of the iniquitous system of spending our money wherever our employees see fit to designate. Third, to secure the introduction of any and all well-defined and established appliances for the preservation of life, health, and limbs of all mine employees. Fourth, to reduce the lowest possible minimum the awful catastrophes which have been sweeping our fellow craftsmen to untimely graves by the thousands, by securing legislation looking to the most perfect system of ventilation, drainage, etc. Fifth, to enforce existing laws, and where none exist, enact and enforce them, calling for a plentiful supply of suitable timber for supporting the roof, pillars, etc., and to have all working places rendered as free from water and impure air and poisonous gases as possible. Sixth, to uncompromisingly demand that 8 hours shall constitute a day's work, and that not more than 8 hours shall be worked in any one day by any mine worker. The very nature of our employment, shut out from the sunlight and pure air, working by the aid of artificial light, in no instance to exceed 1 candle power, would in itself strongly indicate that of all men a coal miner has the most righteous claim to an 8-hour day. Seventh, to provide for the education of our children by lawfully prohibiting their employment until they have attained a reasonably satisfactory education, and in every case until they have attained 14 years of age. Eighth, to abrogate all laws which enable coal operators to cheat the miners, and to substitute laws which enable the miner, under the protection and majesty of the state, to have his coal properly weighed or measured, as the case may be. Ninth, to secure by legislation weekly payments in lawful money. 10th, to render it impossible by legislative enactment in every state, as is now the case in the state of Ohio, for coal operators or corporations to employ Pinkerton detectives or guards or other forces, except the ordinary forces of the state, to take armed possession of the mines in cases of strikes and lockouts. 11th, to use all honorable means to maintain peace between ourselves and employers, adjusting all differences, so far possible, by arbitration and conciliation, that strikes may become unnecessary. The 40 years between 1860 and 1900 saw rapid growth all over America, especially in cities. The U.S. population nearly doubled in size, and many of those people were moving to cities all over the country. Compare the two maps that one would have in the United States. In 1860, only 9 cities had populations of over 100,000. By 1900, there were 38 cities with that many people or more. This population spurt also affected how cities grew. In 1860, Chicago was the 9th largest city in the U.S. By 1900. It was number 2 in it was number 2. In 1860, Brooklyn was the 3rd largest city in the U.S. By 1900, though, what happened to Brooklyn? It became part of New York City. Businesses were growing bigger. Now you bought your clothes and furniture not from a friendly storekeeper, but from a huge mail-order house or a vast department store. In the old days, you dealt with people you knew personally. Now big companies supplied more and more of everybody's needs. Large factories thousands of miles away manufactured more and more of the goods you used each day. To whom would you complain? Whom could you count on? Many families, people who had braved the wilderness and had known loneliness, people who had faced the horrors of the Civil War, were now afraid of bigness. What had happened to the old neighborly spirit? The dangers of bigness were not only imaginary. As the companies that made the things you needed became larger and larger, the number of different companies supplying your needs became fewer and fewer. For example, by 1880, the Standard Oil Company controlled over 90% of the lamp oil refining in the United States. In those days, before electric lights, if you wanted oil to light your house at night, you had to pay whatever price Standard Oil demanded. Bigness meant monopoly. And monopoly meant that a few men had the power to dictate to everybody. Everywhere, it seemed, some company was squeezing out its competitors. In the 1890s, if you wanted sugar for your table, you had to buy it from the company that controlled 98% of the sugar refining in the whole country. For tobacco, you were in the clutches of the American Tobacco Company. Almost every machine, along with the many new ships and bridges and skyscrapers, now use steel. In 1901, the United States Steel Company became the country's first billion-dollar corporation. The go-getters, with the help of their lawyers, invented new ways to combine small businesses into big companies, and they found ways to keep their control secret. One new kind of company, whose only business was to own other companies, was called a trust. The men who owned a trust really, but sometimes secretly, controlled smaller companies that still carried on under their own names. Ambitious go-getters used these methods to build their businesses into empires. Soon there were banking empires and mining empires, steel empires and railroad empires. The men who built them were full of imagination and energy, but some of them were as arrogant and ruthless as the despots of the Middle Ages. Some believed that the only law they had to obey was the law that they made for themselves. Once, when J.P. Morgan, the giant of American banking, heard that the government was about to prosecute his company for violating the laws, he went to see the president. "If we have done anything wrong," he said, "send your man, the Attorney General of the United States, to my man," Morgan's lawyer, "and they can fix it up." Congress passed a law in 1890 that made it a crime for businesses to combine or agree together to prevent competition. This Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to punish restraint of trade or commerce. But like other laws, the law against trust would work only if the government enforced it. Presidents did not want to offend the powerful businessmen who had helped get them elected, and who might help again at the next election. They pretended that the law did not exist. In the rare case when a president dared to use the law, the Supreme Court saved the trusts by thinking up technicalities. For example, in 1895, the Attorney General prosecuted one company that controlled 98% of the sugar refining in the country. But the Supreme Court said that the company really was not guilty of preventing competition under the Sherman Antitrust Act, because it was in manufacturing and not in commerce. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president who actually started to use the power of the national government to protect ordinary Americans. He was elected vice president on the Republican ticket with William B. McKinley in 1900. When President McKinley joined the festivities at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo on September 6, 1901, a man he had never seen before walked up and fired 2 shots at him. Within a week, McKinley was dead. The man who shot President McKinley called himself an anarchist, which meant that he was against all government. But by making Theodore Roosevelt president, he actually helped to give the national government strong powers. No one who visited Theodore Roosevelt as a child would have guessed that he would become a champion of the ordinary American. His father was a well-to-do New York banker. He owned country houses and took his family to Europe for vacations. Some of Teddy Roosevelt's early memories included seeing the Pope during a walk in Rome and visiting the tomb of Napoleon in Paris. Young Teddy had no worries about money, but he had other worries. He suffered from asthma, which made it hard for him to exercise, and his eyesight was poor. He became seriously interested in nature and began collecting specimens of plants and animals. When he was 12, his mother told a maid to throw away some dead mice that the boy had stored in a dresser drawer. "The loss to science," Teddy lamented. "The loss to science." Teddy's father built a gymnasium at home. There, Teddy worked with a punching bag and did pull-ups on the horizontal bars. He also took boxing lessons. By the time he was 17, he was an expert in track events including running, pole vaulting, and high jumping. He became an enthusiastic horseman and a crack shot on his grandfather's country estate at Oyster Bay on Long Island. Throughout his life, Teddy Roosevelt never lost the feeling that he had to make up for the childhood weakness of his body. He never lost his boyish enthusiasm either. One day he was hit in the eye while boxing with a young Army officer. His left eye became completely blind. He managed to keep this secret, and he devised ways to prevent people knowing that he could only see in one eye. He even became world famous as an explorer and big game hunter in Africa and South America. From the White House he preached the strenuous life. Some genteel European diplomats dreaded being assigned to work in Washington when TR was in the White House. They knew he would not permit them to fulfill their diplomatic duties by sipping tea and making polite conversation. He expected them, along with panting generals and members of his cabinet, to join him on exhausting tramps through the countryside. "You must always remember," a British ambassador once explained, "that the president is about 6 years old." Teddy Roosevelt liked a good fight, not only in the boxing arena, but also in politics. He had been shocked that earlier presidents failed to enforce the laws against monopolies, and he was disgusted by the Supreme Court's technicalities. The growing power of corporations worried him. "Of all forms of tyranny," he complained, "the least attractive and the most vulgar is the tyranny of mere wealth, the tyranny of plutocracy." No sooner had TR moved into the White House than he had his chance. The owners of the anthracite coal mines had become reckless about the safety of their men. Workers were dying needlessly each year. In 1901 alone, 440 men died in mining accidents in the anthracite coalfields of Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The men had received no raise in wages in 20 years. Moreover, the companies had promised to pay the men according to the weight of coal they dug, but the companies refused to weigh honestly. Sometimes they made a man dig 4,000 pounds of coal before they gave him credit for a ton, 2,000 pounds. And then to top it off, the companies often forced the miners to spend their wages in company stores that charged especially high prices. By 1902, the miners could endure no more. The union leaders decided to take action. John Mitchell, then the energetic young president of the United Mine Workers of America, was the son of a miner who had lost his life in the mines. Mitchell himself had begun mining at the age of 12. His union, 150,000 strong, included thousands of newcomers who spoke over a dozen different languages. The coal miners went on strike in May of 1902. By October, with winter coming, people feared that the railroads would have to stop running and that the nation would freeze. President Roosevelt came to the miners' rescue. Regardless of who owned the mines, Roosevelt insisted nobody owned the miners. He shamed the mine owners into granting most of the workers' demands. When the strike ended, TR had shown how, in the age of big business, it was possible for the federal government to help. He had proven himself a champion of ordinary Americans. But this was only a beginning. President Roosevelt informed the law against trusts, even when it offended the richest men in the country. He added to his cabinet a Secretary of Commerce and Labor, one of whose jobs was to keep an eye out for monopolies. He sponsored a law making it a crime for the railroads to show favoritism, for example, by giving secret refunds or rebates to anybody. It was just as important, Roosevelt saw, to protect future Americans against the greed of living Americans as it was to protect mine workers against greedy mine owners. He called this conservation. As a young man out west, he had enjoyed the open spaces. From his Dakota ranch, he had ridden the range and explored the wilderness. He loved everything about the West. The cowboy is the life of the trail, fishing and hunting, and he was shocked to see lumber companies wasting forests that had taken centuries to grow. He knew that the wilderness could never be put back. He saw some parts of the country troubled by floods while others lacked water. Saving rivers and streams was just as important as protecting the land or the forests. He called scientists, governors, Supreme Court justices, and others to help him plan an inventory of the natural wealth. Soon, conservation was a popular word. During most of American history, the money to run the federal government had been raised by selling lands from the public domain in the West, by customs duties on imports, and by excise taxes on certain kinds of goods. For example, liquor and tobacco. These taxes were not democratic enough for Roosevelt. Shocked by their swollen and monstrous fortunes, he wanted the rich to pay a bigger share. But the Constitution said that the only direct taxes Congress could pass were those apportioned according to the population of the states. Income was a very different thing from population. During the Civil War, the government somehow had got around those technicalities, and it had actually passed a tax on income. But after the war, the income tax was dropped. Later, when populists and others demanded an income tax, the Supreme Court stood in the way. The Supreme Court said that an income tax was exactly the kind of tax that the Constitution had prohibited. President Roosevelt then demanded an amendment to the Constitution. Within a few years, the required number of states had passed this income tax amendment. Now Congress had the power to tax rich Americans more heavily than they did the poor. And now some people figured taxes themselves would protect most Americans by making it harder for any Americans to become monstrously rich. The income tax was a progressive tax. The higher you progressed up the ladder of wealth, the larger the proportion of your income you had to pay. This was a sign that Americans were beginning to think in a new way. After Theodore Roosevelt, fewer Americans believed it was good enough for the government to be only an umpire. Even in a prosperous democracy, the powers of different citizens and corporations were not equal. In the 20th century, more and more Americans expected their government to be a guardian. They expected it to help protect the weak from the strong.